was wonderful training to go into the military because you get used to being away from home, and you're on your own to a very great degree. And I was pretty young for my age. I was just a little over 16 when I got out of school and graduated with a good diploma, And the war was a horrendous thing. We had many British children at Berkshire whose parents had sent them over to avoid the bombings that the Germans were using on population areas of England. And we heard a lot, we saw a lot. A lot of the faculty of that school volunteered and went off to service. The result of it was that we were very aware. And of course, our families were also, particularly those that had teenage children, because they knew they would one way or another wind up in the war in all probability. And the United States didn't enter the war for a couple of years after England and the rest of the world were fighting for their very existence. But the idea of somebody coming over here, a brutal enemy that really slaughtered and killed and maimed and bombed, and was trying to conquer the world, the very idea of these people trying to capture our country, do away with America, kill our families. It was just too much for me, so that when I was, as I said, 16, I volunteered for the U.S. Navy. At that time, if you were under 18, you could not volunteer without your parents' approval. So I had to get my dad and mother's approval, my father particularly, and they were actually delighted that I was volunteering because they felt so strongly about the survival of America. And my family, many years past in the 1800s and 1700s, were people that came to America for freedom and all the things that we know that this country stands for, so that they, deep in their soul, believed it was a great thing to get out and fight for it. And as sad as they were that we had to risk our lives, they very much approved, and therefore getting my dad to sign was no effort. He was just delighted, and as I remember, I think he cried a little bit because I was so young, but we did it. I went down in New York to Pine Street, which was the Navy headquarters, and volunteered there, had my physical and so on.
So did you go to basic training when you were
Well,
16?
I'll take you through that very quickly. I was of an age where when I volunteered, of course, they assigned me to the USS Long Island, which was an aircraft carrier, and the country, a small aircraft carrier. It was originally a Liberty ship class of about 10,000 tons. And I went aboard that ship as a seaman second class, which is the lowest rank you can get in the Navy, familiarly called a swabby. And, it was very exciting. I left the United States on the ship and went under the Golden Gate Bridge, and that was the last I saw of America
Wow.
for a good long time. And it was very, very exciting time. And I guess if you weren't married and you didn't have kids, it was as tough as it was doable.
Right.
I felt very badly for the people that were shipped overseas that had families and wives and so on, because it was just tearing their lives apart. But I thought it was at that point a great adventure, and I was very excited about the challenge. A little bit of fear, but not too much. And off we went. Uh, After a very short time, they sent me back for officers training. Somebody must have discerned I don't know what the attribute is that would qualify it, but I went back to Trinity College in a program where I took all engineering courses, things like heat power and thermodynamics, integral calculus, chemistry, etc.
Now, how old were you when you did that?
Honestly, I don't remember
Really?
dates and age specifically, but I was very young.
Right. But would it have been like a couple years after you first when?
Well, when I got out of there, but I think it was fairly imminently after I went overseas. I went back in this program, and it was all, matter of fact, ultimately I got an electrical engineering degree because of that background. But I went to this training course, and after about a year or a little longer, I was sent to a pre-midshipman school in Asbury Park, New Jersey, which we fondly called Buchenwald on the Atlantic because it was so tough. They'd put us out on the beach in our underwear in 20 below zero weather
Oh,
and do setting up exercises.
that's
But
horrible.
anyhow, it was a rigid test, I think, of our stamina and our determination. Interestingly enough, they had me in a room. We were in an old commandeered hotel. They didn't have barracks at this place, and there were 5 guys in the room, and we're all named Davidson. So one guy from Texas, about 9 feet tall, and little Philly here from Connecticut. But it was at a time when the United States was trying to gear up. Our production facilities were going full tilt. Women were working in factories to make ships and all the rest of the armament needed for war. And it was a time really that was unprecedented in this country. And when the ships began to roll out, it was just overwhelming the amount of armament and the amount of ships that the Navy received in a very short time once the production came to maturity. And the result of it was that they needed the men to man these ships. And they had several classes, and they were very smart in the sense that the younger guys, they gave a chance to grow up a little bit before they put them on a ship
Right.
with a rank. And so I went to this pre-midshipman school, got through that. It was a very short time. It was over a winter. And then I went to the Navy had commandeered a school that was like a maritime academy,
Mm-hmm.
which is Fort Schuyler, New York. And that was a really formal training place. We had, in each class, we had about, I don't know, I'm guessing, I'd say 5,000 men, all training to be officers with the rank of midshipman. And midshipman is somebody half between the guys that swab the decks and the guys that tell them to do it. You're neither fish nor fowl, but it was great training. And when I got through that, and I think I graduated 20th out of a class of 1,100
Wow.
in my particular division. And at that point, the numbers of officers kind of caught up with the numbers of ships coming out. And they gave us a chance. I was amazed, but they asked us to choose the kind of service we would like, which is unprecedented in the Navy. And I three choices, and my first choice was cruiser duty, Pacific Fleet. My second was Fleet Sound School in Miami, Florida, and my third was Third Naval District in New York, which is pretty close to home. So I got my first choice, right, and off I went to the Columbia. And my training days were over, and I reported aboard the Columbia as a catapult officer. And after that, I, as time went by and as I became acquainted with the ship and the people on the ship became acquainted with me, I had excellent skippers. I learned a lot. My gunnery officer was a terrific guy. And they were kidding me. They said, you know, you're going to be a catapult officer to begin with. And they explained the duties to me, and I still have the book that shows the responsibilities. And they said, if you get the plane off the ship safely, when the pilot gets back, he'll give you a bottle of scotch. And the first lieutenant was responsible for retrieving the plane and bringing it back aboard the ship. And if you shoot it into the ocean, he'll give you a bottle of scotch for getting rid of one of his responsibilities. I didn't think that was too funny, but that's what they said.
So,
Like, I
so
did.
what were exactly like your responsibilities? You had to make sure
Well,
that.
you had to launch the plane. You had to take care of the equipment. You were in charge of a group of men who actually did all the things. But to get a SC-1 Seahawk off the ship, you had to have several factors in good order. And one is that the ship had to be going at least 15 to 18 knots, which is, fairly fast. It's not flank speed, but it's pretty fast for a 630 some odd foot boat. And in addition to that, you had to have the catapults aimed, uh, let's say, off the port bow, 15 degrees, which means you're in an angle to the ship, and you had to have the wind at a certain speed, and the wave roll had to be reasonably ideal. And I might add, it wasn't always ideal, but you had to have all these factors in your favor, and you had to launch the plane when the ship began an uproll
That had to be
or pitch.
scary.
And I was a young guy trying to keep all this in order, and there's a live pilot sitting in that plane, so it was a lot of responsibility. And I never shot one into the water, I'm very pleased to say. And what these
So you
planes
never
did,
got your bottle of scotch.
uh,
So you never got your
no,
bottle
that
of
was
scotch.
that was a fairy tale.
Oh, okay.
You're not allowed to have scotch aboard ship in the Navy. And if I said I did, I'd probably be telling the truth, but that's another story. But anyhow, the that job led to second division officer, which was pretty responsible position in that I had some responsibility to the two main battery turrets, which were 6-inch guns. That means the opening at the barrel was 6 inches, and we had three of those in each turret. On the stern of the ship, we had, in other words, had 6 guns, and we could shoot 3 shells a minute from each. And so that means that if my arithmetic is still okay, it means that we had 18 shells going off
Per minute.
in the area of my responsibility, or 36 on the ship. And what they did is they would send up the shells and the semi-fixed ammunition, and the powder source would be also loaded. And it was all manually loaded. Come up on an elevator, all be manually loaded, and it had terrific firepower for those days. We also had 5-inch guns and 40 and 20 millimeter. It's interesting that the 5-inch guns, toward the end of the war, I think the Atlanta was the first ship to have them, but we were converted to 5-inch 51s, which was more an anti-aircraft gun. So ordnance was very important to some of my responsibilities. And in addition to that, the captain of the ship picked 5 young ensigns for deck duty, which means that I had responsibility then to serve as officer of the deck and other positions that they determined. 4 of the 5 guys chosen, and 2 of them are still alive, were all Annapolis graduates. I mean, this was their career.
Right.
And in fact, one of them still alive up in New London, New Hampshire. A good friend of mine, Julian Le Bourgeois, who probably got into more trouble than anybody else on the ship, but nobody knew about it because he was pretty smart. And eventually they made him a vice admiral. So he knew the ropes, but he and I were good friends. But anyhow, we were all given this responsibility of officer of the deck. We were trained for it. We were taught it, and it was a very onerous responsibility because, in a sense, you have the fate of 1,100 men in your hands if you make a mistake, which I did once,
Really?
really. And I was standing officer of the deck watch, and This is after the war, and when you make a turn on these ships when you're in station keeping, which means that the 4 cruisers that we traveled with, the Cleveland, Columbia, Montpelier, and Denver, were all in a line with 2,000 yards between each of them. And the way that you know to make a turn, they explained to me, is you watch the kick of the screws of the ship in front of you. In other words, when the ship ahead makes a turn, it stirs up the water in a certain way, and also to line up the superstructure in a certain way. And if those conditions are met, and you're traveling at, let's say, 18 knots, that's when you give the command to come over 9 Corpin, which means a 90-degree turn to the left or to the right. I don't even remember what that was, but in any event, I gave the command too soon. And what happened was I saw the kick in the water. It probably was a nice big school of fish. And I gave the command, and we started heading amidships for the ship in front of me. And immediately I gave a second command, which was not authorized on this exercise, to try to come parallel to the ship ahead of me, aiming right at amidships of it. It looked like I'm going to hit it. Right. So if I gave the command, and we came parallel to the ship ahead of us, and I don't think we had 20 yards between us. It was pretty scary. At which point the captain came running up on the bridge, and he said, "Mr. Davidson, what did you do?" And I explained to him. He said, "Well, it's a good thing you called that second command, because if you hadn't, I'd be in Portsmouth Naval Penitentiary, and you'd be standing right there next to me." Well, many years later, I was eating lobster in New Hampshire, across the river from where the penitentiary was. It's a pretty formidable looking place. And I looked at it, and I smiled. My wife said, "What's so funny?" And I told her the story. But, I was lucky. And as I said, they gave us the best training they could, but we were still not career sailors. And we were put in positions at the end of the war that really were somewhat dangerous. And fortunately, we all got through, and I consider that because of the captain's good judgment and the people he picked to do the job. And I was, always very honored by that, even though I did have one screw up, sort of. But it was a great experience. And remember, all this was before I was 22, 23. Right. And I would say that in later life, the reason I have kind of leadership in my veins is because the Navy instills it in you, that it's an honor to lead if you're fair and so on. And I've always tried to do that, and the Navy was a tremendous training ground. And I don't want to get into the gore and the blood and guts of war, but I think you've all seen enough of that. And so I'm going to spare you in this interview, but I think that we had a lot of fun things, particularly after the war. The ship I was on made a goodwill cruise to the Mediterranean. We went up to Casco Bay, Maine, to do some work with anti-submarine and training. And we had, on one cruise, we had a couple of hundred midshipmen with us who were out training. And the skipper of the ship, B.B. Adele, who later went on to be commandant of the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida, said to me, "You're sort of a native of these places." He said, "Why don't you go over and parlay with the natives and buy us 800 pounds of lobsters?" I said, "Yes, sir, I'll do that." Well, the good part of that story is I was able to buy them for 32 cents a pound. Nice. And today, that's incredible. No. But anyhow, a lot of the guys on the ship came from all over the country, and many of them had never had lobster. And they didn't know what this strange creature was. But we had some really good times at the end. And I came back and finished up getting an engineering degree at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. Got a electrical engineering degree, and then after that, And I might add, I did that on the GI Bill of
I was just
Rights,
gonna
and
ask.
I got credit for midshipman school courses and so on. Fortunately, I had taken some at Trinity before, and then I re-entered civilian life, and I've been in several different occupations. I formed chain of retail stores, which eventually were in 23 states, called the Weather Vane, and that was my
Oh,
primary business. Yeah,
I remember that.
that was fun because we manufactured all over the world. And my wife and I used to go to China and to Japan. I did business with all the
Wow.
trading companies, and it was fascinating. And it's amazing, really, how, with the propaganda that was flowing during the war and prior to it, in American media, you had to hate the Japanese. What charming, wonderful people they could be, except for women's issues and a few other things. And as far as China's concerned, my wife and I were invited by the government to look at their textile industry, and we spent quite a bit of time there. And today, it's so interesting to me. They really picked our brains clean, and today you can see them as probably the dominant economic country in the world, next to the United States and a few others. But the Navy was terrific training. I mean, you make decisions with confidence. You do make some mistakes. You learn from your mistakes. I also got into banking somehow. This was a time when the country was having a lot of trouble in the banking industry with mergers and amalgamations, and everybody was playing Pac-Man. And I think I wound up serving 5 different banks in a period of about 10 years
Oh,
because they kept getting gobbled up by bigger ones. And I still go back, I mean, to my earlier memories when I went to grade school in New Britain, Connecticut, where I was born. And I later in life became chairman of the board of the hospital that I was born in,
mm-hmm.
which was, important to me. And I, uh, I still remember the bread lines in New Britain. I still remember people dropping their children off at orphanages with the hope that someday they can afford to take them back home, and many of them never got to any other home than where they were sent. And I remember the bread lines where people stood in line to get food. And I mean, people wearing shirts and ties, and not the typical unfortunate people that really, for many reasons, couldn't hold a job. And it was a terrible time. And I think now that we're going through the beginnings, and hopefully we'll never get to the end of that kind of an existence, it's like deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra used to say. So it's been quite a life, and I'm glad I could participate in it. And I guess there isn't much I'd do differently.
Perfect. If you don't mind if we go back a little, you served in the Pacific area,
Mm-hmm.
correct? Um, you told me your job experience. Do you remember your first impressions of? I don't know where you went first, but did you land on any islands or?
Yeah, well, I think the first island I went by was an island in the Marshall Islands called Ulithi Atoll, Mogmog.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, all I pretty much looked at the first several months was water. And we traveled sometime in battle groups, sometime in smaller groups. I think one of the most fantastic impressions that I had was at the end of the war. I was sitting up in an officers' club in Apra Harbor in Guam, and I'd had a couple of scotches, and felt mellow, and the war was all over, and they were getting ready to ship us home, to get the ship turned around and ship us to Philadelphia. And it was getting to be sunset, and I looked down at the harbor, and I couldn't believe what I saw. I saw literally hundreds of warships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, subs, planes, unbelievable. And I thought to myself, this must be what Hannibal saw and felt when he took the elephants over the Alps. You know, a signature moment in history, and hopefully it's the harbinger of better things to come.
Absolutely.
And the islands, we spent time in truck. We spent time in the area of Iwo Jima, Chichijima, Tinian, definitely Hebrides, all of the islands pretty much in the Pacific in that region. I spent some time in the Philippine Islands. I was in an officer's rest camp for a short time in Tacloban, which was the provincial capital of one of the big islands in southern Philippines. And I have memories of it all, but my youngest son, I have 5 children, and my youngest son has a favorite saying, which I've kind of adopted, and I kind of felt that way, and what it was is what is. And I think that the key to it was adapting to where you were, when you were there, and what you were doing. And stay very flexible and try to get the best out of every place you're at.
Mm-hmm.
And, there was a lot of sameness to some of the other experiences, but good or bad. But you always think ahead to the point where, God, I hope it's all over and I want to go home.
Yeah. Now, just for the record, you were on the USS Columbia. Um, you mentioned earlier that you were, that was in 10 major battles.
I'm sorry?
You mentioned earlier that ship was in 10 major battles.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's where the sameness comes in,
Yeah.
but they're all different. But you have in the book that I gave you about the Columbia, the technical list and dates and everything of the battles. And I would say the most spectacular thing were night battles, because it's
We see the lights of the.
yeah, it was very spectacular.
And you also mentioned the. Did you want to talk at all about the story you told me earlier about the kamikaze planes hitting the?
Yeah, well, yeah, as you all know, kamikaze is Japanese for divine wind, and the Japanese pilots felt that this was a duty to their emperor and to their country to die for the emperor. And when they became kamikaze pilots, they were given a ceremonial white scarf, which they put around their neck. They did some kind of a hocus pocus ceremony. It was very serious to them because they knew they were going to give their lives for their country, and they would keep coming at you. You could tear up their planes, and they would still fly them into you if they could. And they caused a great deal of damage right at the end of the war, when the Japanese were getting desperate. And I was in one of the Japanese cities after the war that was it was a provincial capital, Kyoto, many centuries ago. And somehow or other, we did not destroy that city. I think there was some kind of an understanding, and it was pretty much intact. I mean, you could see the Shogun's palace and all the wonderful architecture and so on. But I was on a tour bus, and I got into an argument with the driver. I waited till everybody cleared out, and the reason I did, he had made a statement to everybody that kamikaze pilots were cowards. And it just, they may have been an enemy, but they died with certainly respect on my part, as well as fear.
I'm not sure I would.
And that really angered me greatly. And I very quietly said to him, what in the world did you mean by that? They're the greatest heroes that Japan has had since the Samurai warriors. And he said, I didn't mean it the way it came out. He said, what I meant was toward the end of the war, when they needed the kamikaze pilots, Many of them were totally inexperienced. They really didn't want to give their lives for the emperor, and yet they died. And they were bad pilots. I let it go. I figured I'm not going to reopen the war, and I passed it. But I detected a feeling in Japan of wanting to, well, certainly to forget about it. In fact, it was only about 10 years ago or thereabouts when Japanese school children learned about all the atrocities and the positions that Japan took during their march through the Orient and how cruel they were, and so on. And many books were written. This is interesting. I went back to Trinity when I was 75 years old, and I took courses in Japanese pre-World War II history because I wanted to find out, what in the world made them do what they did. And one of the things that fascinated me was the fact that when they finally started telling about the war from their perspective, it was only maybe 10 years before that time, and the reason, I guess, is because they were ashamed of it. They lost the war. They did terrible things, and they just didn't want to teach their school children what their place was in it. And around that time, there was an American captain, McVeigh, who was a skipper of the Indianapolis, which is a very famous heavy cruiser in the Pacific, and he had been court-martialed because the ship was sunk. It was 5 days after it was sunk. It hadn't been announced. No survivors up until that point had been searched for, and only 300 guys out of 1,500, which was about the complement of a heavy cruiser then, survived. And the sharks got most of them. Right. And the reason being is that was the ship that carried the atom bomb parts to Tinian and Saipan area. And the Navy Department didn't want anybody to know that ship was out there. Interestingly enough, the Navy Department court-martialed McVeigh on the basis that he didn't follow Navy orders of zigzagging through those waters. And the end result of that was that the Japanese captain came to his 25 years later, his revived court-martial that his McVeigh's children pushed and worked toward, and made the statement that it didn't make a damn bit of difference what McVeigh did. He had him dead in his sights. He was a submarine captain, and he would have sunk him anyways. And they exonerated McVeigh 25 years after he was court-martialed. And McVeigh, whose father and grandfather were both admirals in the history of the Navy, committed suicide. So he never lived to hear that he was exonerated. But that's why that literature was so important. You get the other perspective of what really happened.
You had mentioned also earlier the truck.
Yes.
And you landed there?
I'm sorry?
You landed there? Did you?
Yes, I landed there.
Mm-hmm.
They sent in junior officers, some enlisted men, and we carried a contingent of about 40 Marines. Mm-hmm. And it was a little tenuous because we had just accepted the surrender of the Japanese there, and we didn't know what would happen. Right. But the starvation and the abjectly miserable living conditions, you just can't describe it.
Now, the people living there, were they civilians? Or
there were about 90,000 people and about 100,000 Japanese troops. The 90,000 were natives of Truk, and it was just a horrible scene. And it was a very important and strategic area. And one of the reasons why we bypassed them and just kept bombing them on these bombing runs was because of the experience in Iwo Jima, how many lives it would cost. Right. And I think that to sum it all up, the thing that we all pretty much felt was after the 2 atom bombs went off, with a large loss of life, did we do the right thing or did we do a tragic thing? It's interesting. I had the fellow, when I was at Trinity, I had the fellow who was the Marine colonel who led the strategy in Iwo Jima. He's from New Britain, actually.
Really?
And, uh, and he gave a lecture there. And before he lectured, these are all graduate students. How many people think we did a bad thing? How many people think we did a good thing? It was like 95-5.
Really?
That we did a terrible, terrible thing. When he finished his dissertation, the feeling was 2/3 felt we did the right thing and 1/3 felt we did the wrong thing. Reason being that the loss of life, if we had to eventually attack the mainland of Japan, the loss of Japanese life would be numbered in the millions. I think the number that was rattling around was 4 million, not to mention American lives, but Japanese lives. And the very fact that this thing was done, and it certainly negated the need to do anything further, and the Japanese surrendered, was something that on both sides saved enormous number of lives. And it's very hard now, if you're a younger person, to sit back. You say, oh, it's terrible, it's awful, it's bad. But in those days, very honestly, those of us aboard a ship were so grateful that he had blown the bomb.
Right.
It probably saved our lives. We were out there.
Yeah, they were preparing for the giant invasion.
I'm sorry?
Before they dropped the bomb, weren't they preparing for the giant invasion of Japan?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and they didn't have to do it.
And they didn't have to do that.
Yeah, and Iwo Jima was a perfect case in point. When you start doing island hopping, what it can cost you, and in Japan it would be even 20 times worse, or God knows how many times worse, because these people were now defending their homes.
Right, and it was civilian life as well.
I'm talking about civilians. Yeah.
While you were on the ship, how did you stay in touch with your family?
I'm sorry?
How did you stay in touch with your family when you were on the
I
ship?
didn't.
You didn't?
No, I ran into one of my brothers in Pearl Harbor, my older brother, who was executive officer of a subchaser, PC 1238. It was a very small ship. It was only 173 feet long and about 38 feet wide. And I used to tease him and call it the Donald Duck Navy. His name was Donald. And he's 88 now. And we just did what we had to do while we did it. It was a whole different life, and you had to forget about what was going on at all. And furthermore, our letters were censored.
Right.
And you couldn't tell them a lot.
Right, you couldn't tell them where you were or anything
No,
like that.
no.
So your brother was in the Navy as well?
Yes. Yeah, he was a lieutenant senior grade, and he was older than I. And he had done a training course at Yale in 1938. And interestingly enough, he went to school at Avon Old Farms back in the good old days in the 30s, when it was a small boys' school. Still is a boys' school.
What was the food like on board?
What was what?
What was the food like?
Well, for officers, it was fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
We had a wardroom with about 40 stewards' mates, white tablecloths. Any time of day or night, we could go into the wardroom and order a steak dinner.
Wow.
I mean, the food was just incredible. And
what about when you were a Swabi?
not so good.
Not so good?
I'd rather not comment on that. But that wasn't aboard that ship, you know.
Right.
It was, matter of fact, I'll tell you a quick story. At the pre-training at Asbury Park, we all had to do kitchen duty. And I was in the kitchen one day when they were grinding meat. It sort of looked like hamburger, you know. And one of the cooks got a finger caught in the grinder, and it went into about 500 pounds of hamburger.
Oh, no.
And then they had a typical Navy jurisdictional debate about what they should do with the meat. P.S. They served it.
When you were on board, did you always have plenty of supplies, or did you need?
Well, we had plenty of supplies, and at one point we picked up sailors from a small aircraft carrier that had been sunk called the Omni Bay. And we picked up some of their sailors and took them aboard ship because we had a sick bay that was really good. We had a doctor, and some of the guys from the Omni Bay were aboard our ship for as much as 2 months. Others we were immediately, as best we could, transferred to hospital ships. And we had pretty good facilities. 5-man barber shop. We had ice cream making machines.
Oh,
You know, it was really, cruisers were big enough to have a lot of the luxuries of life.
that's good.
We had our own chaplain. It was great. So those that are interested in the spiritual side of life could get comfort.
When you did you feel pressure or stress when you were on board, or
Did I what?
did you feel any pressure or stress when you were on board?
What do you mean pressure? Like seasickness?
No. Were you ever seasick?
No, not
No,
there.
you never got
Only
seasick.
in Clinton, Connecticut.
Did you feel stress like during the battles and or
Excitement.
excitement?
Yeah.
Do you think that was because of your age? Because you were so
No,
young?
no, no,
Or?
no, no, no. You have excitement. Some people had fear.
Mm-hmm.
It's all the human instincts, you know.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever do anything for good luck?
Sure.
What?
I used to wear besides my ID thing, I used to carry a necklace that had a St. Christopher's cross that was blessed by Pope Pius II
Oh wow.
and given to me before I went overseas by my father's first, he ran a company,
Mm-hmm.
but by his first employee,
Oh
a
wow.
lady from New Britain named Helen Daly. And Helen and I really didn't get along all that well, but before I left, she said, "Wear
She
this."
gave you that.
And I think if she really didn't like me, she wouldn't have given it to me.
What did you do to entertain yourselves?
Oh, we played cards, we talked. There's a picture up here behind me of the 5 junior officers and myself
Mm-hmm.
in one of the bunk rooms, and you shoot the breeze, you know.
Did you ever get to see any entertainers? Did you ever get to see any USO shows or anything like that?
Not really. I think we had I think he was a world middleweight or boxing champion of the world, a fellow named Frank Apostoli was aboard the ship. So the ship and the whole Navy, for that matter, the bigger ships, were very large on boxing.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried it once, and this thing here called the button, and they hit me there, and I don't remember the rest of the story. But my career was very short-lived, but it was a kind of a contest that ships in the fleet, even though you're in the same division, very often rivalries developed,
Mm-hmm.
and it replaced football and baseball, you know. But as far as the big name entertainers, they generally went to the bases that were pretty secure,
Right.
and also there were had a large number of people who were entertainers could really be significant to their quality of life.
Right. Um, did you get to? Did you ever get to go on leave or liberty while you were on board?
Yeah, once we got back to the States, and I don't remember where else. Not much though. You
No.
really, for what there was to do out there, I mean, you really didn't want to go on liberty. You want to stay safe.
You wanted to stay on the boat. Do you recall any particularly humorous or funny events?
The chopped up hamburger wasn't
Well,
enough.
that was pretty funny. That pretty much qualifies.
Yeah, no, there are lot of funny things happen. A lot of amazing things happen. At a reunion years later, I found this very interesting. There were two guys on a 40 millimeter mount. Each one thought the other one was killed when the kamikazes hit.
Mm-hmm.
And many years later at a reunion, they both showed up. And it was a very joyous reunion because they both had thought the other guy was gone.
That must have been fantastic.
That was great. That's not funny. That was wonderful.
That was good, yeah.
Yeah.
What did you think of your fellow officers?
Well, I had a lot of respect for most of them. I had particular respect for the Annapolis graduates. These guys were so well trained. But, like in any society, there were a couple of guys that weren't so wonderful. And in the Navy, you learn to keep your mouth shut and do what you're supposed to do and let the chips fall where they may. One thing a division officer had to do was stand at captain's mast, which is like a trial that the captain ran. He was the law on a ship. And every once in a while, you'd have a captain's mast where anybody that got into trouble for anything would have to stand before the captain. He needed an officer to represent him. So I thought maybe, gee, I ought to become a lawyer,
Right.
I'm doing pretty well with this stuff. But it ranged everywhere from justification of venereal diseases that appear aboard a ship after you hit a port, and other things that did happen. I mean, when we left the Panama Canal area, there were an awful lot of sick young guys who had never been out of Rome, Georgia. They get join the Navy and see the world. Well, so that there were other situations where disrespect and so on. But as far as officers are concerned, the only time that I really had it bad is at the end of the war, and I was standing opposite the deck in Philadelphia, which is where the ship came into, and they were sending new senior officers who had spent the war in Washington in many cases to take over responsibilities on ships of the fleet. And that was a very tough thing. I think I think that's one of them. But any hey pup, would you explain to her that the interview is for us, not for her? That one.
All right.
But this commander came out from Washington to assume the role of executive officer, which is the second highest next to the captain. And I'm not going to mention his name because knowing him, it's so many years later, he's probably still alive. I mean, guys like that don't die.
Right.
But he was an interesting character. I was standing officer of the deck watch, and all of a sudden he came running down, came aboard the ship, and you're supposed to salute the flag and report to the OD and so on. And he had something in his hand. And he said, "Mr. Davidson, did you know what that was that went astern of us?" I said, "Yes, sir. It was a British frigate. And we were, mind you, a dock across from the Officers Club." And he said, "Well, what are you supposed to do?" I said, "Notice it." I didn't think there was anything special he had to do. He said, "Well, here's what you're supposed to do." And he quoted Navy regs, such and such, a paragraph and so on. And he said, "You are supposed to dip the colors." I said, "But sir, we're not underway. We're at the dockside. You're still supposed to dip the colors." And I apologized, and I didn't argue any further. And about 20 minutes later, he came running down, and he had this thing in his hand. He looked like Captain Bligh. He had a spyglass. And he said, "Also, Navy regs say you're supposed to carry these." Well, in the meantime, Captain Adele had asked me if I would be interested in shipping over for another 3 years in the Navy, and because he liked my work and so on. And he was about to assume command of the Pensacola Naval Air Station, which was tempting, it really was. And I'd get a bump up in rank. By that time, I'd probably be a senior grade lieutenant. And I'm looking at the stripes, I figure this is not a bad deal. Until this fellow came down and hit me with all this stuff. And then I began to think, God, there are probably going to be a lot more like him in the peacetime Navy. And I told Adele, I don't think so. I said, "Thank you so much for thinking of me, and I appreciate."
So if he hadn't said that,
If I might have, I may not have either, but I was seriously thinking about it. But this commander definitely put the crimp on the whole deal, and all he was doing was his job, because technically he was right.
Right.
It's just that I was not used to that kind of stuff going on a ship, That was one of my experiences with an officer who wasn't so terrific. Most of them were wonderful. They really were, yeah.
Yeah. So when the ship came back home, you said it went through the Panama Canal, and were you discharged right after? Were you discharged from the Navy?
No, no, we went up to Casco, Maine. We went to Newport, Rhode Island, where some of the junior officers were assigned to the Navy War College, which is still in Newport.
Oh yeah.
And Admiral Shumford is the head of it now. And it's really a great institution. And I forget what courses we took there, but they were very, very professional, and we had a great time in Newport.
So that was probably what 1946 and then 45 or.
No, probably by the end of 1946 or 7. I don't remember which.
All right.
As I told you, I'm not good on
Right.
chronology.
So after your discharge, what did you do in the days and weeks following that?
In the what?
In the days and weeks following your discharge.
Well, I went back to Trinity for one thing.
Right.
And
did you get a job right away, or did you go back to?
Yeah, I went to work in the retail business, and at that time, people didn't have finished products. Most of the factories in this country were making things for the war, and in the textile end of it, they were making uniforms. And the result of it was some pretty shoddy looking stuff. So the whole industry had to revitalize itself. And at that time, I went to work. My father had a small store in New Britain called the Fair, and I went back to work there. And I went in as a worse than a seaman, third class. I carried bolts of flannel from the warehouse to the store. And that was my responsibility. And I want to tell you, it was a real come down. I had to learn all over again to develop some humility, which probably didn't do me any harm. Honestly, I mean, it was a good thing at that time of life. And the reason that that we were selling so much flannel is there were no finished products, and women sewed. And boy, they sewed some great stuff. So I helped measure this stuff, and that's where I began. And then I became a candy buyer, and to this day I like candy. And even though I'm sort of a diabetic, I break the rules as long as I can. Yeah, but I'll tell you how everything's made, whether it's a Necco wafer or whatever it is.
Oh,
It's
really?
very fascinating. And the best part of the job is that if you get stuck with something, which is always the fear of retailers, you can eat it, literally. Because the old saying is you can't eat it if you're stuck with it.
That's right.
Well, candy's not doing good.
You said your education was supported by the GI Bill.
Yes, totally. And I might add, when I went back at age 75 to take some more courses at Trinity, the first thing I did when I walked in is I said, "Is the GI Bill of Rights still going?"
Was it?
Hell no. Are you
No?
kidding? No.
Oh.
I was only kidding anyhow. But
And did you make any close friendships while you were?
yes, I did. I did.
Do you still keep in touch?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the guys at our reunion, I'm closer to them than I am to the fellow officers that I served with, who were mostly Annapolis graduates, and now in later life they're pretty cliquey because they've all been admirals, you know.
Oh yeah. And you said, how often do you have reunions?
Once a year,
Once a year.
as long as we can.
Yeah.
Interesting thing on reunions, a lot of the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the sailors come to these reunions now, and just this year, and so many of them have become members of the association, and those that have relatives that have passed away, so many of them now have a keen interest in it that we accepted them as full members.
I'm just going to pause it for a second. That's really neat. And so did you go to, was Vance Elementary near where Vance Hall is now, like in the center of the campus?
No, Vance School is up in the west end of town. Do you know where Klinberg Home is?
No.
Uh, do you know where Avery Soda Factory is? Right,
Absolutely.
right down the street from there.
Very neat. So how did Davidson Hall end up being named for your
Well,
birthplace?
Larry was he was the head of the four state universities at one
Oh, of
time.
course.
When Meskel was governor, and I think he was appointed many, many years ago by Ella Grasso.
Probably.
Yeah,
That's when I think that all that was named.
so he put a lot of years into it.
All right. So we were talking about your close friendships and the reunions. Um, did you join any veterans organizations?
Well, that's an interesting story. I never talked about the war. I never talked about my military service, and I never joined an organization. The only thing that I started going to about 20 years ago